Oh, that's new. There we go. Hello and welcome to episode 28 of Great Things with Great Tech, the podcast highlighting companies doing great things with great technology. My name's Anthony Spiteri, and in this episode, we're talking to Guy C. Holmes, CEO and President of TapeArk. Welcome to the show, Guy.
Thanks, Anthony. Glad to make lucky number 28 for you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So just before we get into the history of TapeArk and talking about tapes, who would have thought, but there's a great story here to be told for sure. If you love great things with great tech and would like to feature in future episodes, you can click on the link in the show notes or go to launch.gtwgt.com and register your interest. And just as a reminder, as usual, all episodes are on the GTWGT YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please click on the link below. And also, GTWGT is on all good podcast platforms, distributed by anchor.fm, but you can get us on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all other good platforms. So with that, Guy, let's get into talking about tapes. And a company, TapeArk, that's still fairly young, but from your own experiences, it's got quite an interesting sort of path to, when you guys started the company. But maybe just talk about the founding in 2018, but how it really came to be, and also a bit of your history, because just to put into perspective, you're in Dallas at the moment. You're American born, but you lived majority of your life now, I think, in Perth, where I come from. So there's an interesting connection here. So let's talk about you first in the history, and let's see what made you start TapeArk.
Okay, beautiful. I'm American born. I was doing a degree in Florida, and I met an Aussie who was traveling at the time. She was 18, and we got married pretty quickly after that. And wow. We got accepted. She got accepted to University of Sydney, Amanda. And she suggested I apply to a university in Australia as well. So I did, and I got accepted. So we packed everything up and moved to Australia, where I did a physics degree at Macquarie University in New South Wales.
Wow. Okay.
Prior to that, I was in the military, and I was a combat medic, and I had a fair bit of medical experience, and I was a certified paramedic. And I came to Australia to go to university with my wife, and I got a job at St. Vincent's Hospital working in a medical laboratory there for a group of cardiologists, and did that for a few years while I was studying my geophysics degree, and eventually moved to Perth to open an office for a geophysical software company. And
okay.
So I ended up in Perth.
So that's kind of like, because obviously, military, physics, but then technology, how did that come about by what you were doing within St. Vincent's?
I was certainly building some technology resources there. It was a private clinic that did various cardiac tests on patients who were going to have angiograms or what have you. And I treated it, even though I was working there in a medical capacity, I kind of treated it as a small business, and wanted to grow it, and added new equipment and new resources and got new facilities and that sort of thing. So I think it was probably the entrepreneurial side more than the tech side that I got a flavor of how to run a business with someone else's money. The best way to give it a shot.
Definitely low risk.
Yeah, that's right. So. Moved to Perth. I've had 5 little Aussies now in Perth, and
wow, 5.
Yeah, 5 kids.
Wow, okay. It's brave.
That's
brave.
Yeah, you can see. The star at the top. And I've been living in Perth now for over 25 years.
Beautiful. So so you've got this business, you've moved it across, and you've kind of started something similar in Perth. Obviously, we're talking about, do the maths, like the 90s sort of period and whatnot. Over those years, you've done a few different things in different businesses in the lead up to TapeArk. But how did you kind of get yourself to a position where you were thinking about, how do I solve the problem of tapes?
It actually goes back that far. So a lot of the work we were doing in that geophysics company was receiving data that needed to be processed to look for ore bodies, and the data would arrive on tape. Then we would read those tapes and do the processing work. And we started receiving so much tape that we needed to work out how to manage it in terms of the sheer volume of tapes coming in. And also we needed to kind of properly archive the data before we started working on it to make sure we weren't working on originals and corrupting things and, making sure that we're taking care of the client's data. So we developed a data management division within the company I was working in, and I was asked to take that division up and run it and open it in Perth, which I did. And so I opened the office in Perth, and about 2 years into that, the business was growing pretty substantially. And I did a management buyout, and I bought the data management division of that company out and took it on as my own company. So I raised some money, bought the division out, and then built a company out of that, which became known as Spectrum Data.
Spectrum Data, okay, which I do know about and have heard. So what sort of time frame was that?
That was 2013.
Okay, righto. So you spun this out. You've seen potential in it, you guys. And I guess before we get into more about what TapeArk specifically does, which I think is pretty I thought it was self-explanatory, but then again, I'm biased because I know the background. What's the problem with tapes? Like, what are we trying to solve? I think you talked about it in that processing. Like you've got this tape, you've got lots of data sitting on this medium, which is fragile the older it gets. I think you talked about not wanting to run it through its paces without making copies, so you protect the integrity of the original data if it's critical data. But from your perspective, what is the problem with tape?
Well, there's a few of them. I think the first thing that we realized, or that I realized, was that when we were dealing with oil companies, we were receiving very large volumes of tape, not 10 tapes with somebody's collection of data on it, but we received one seismic survey from an oil company that was on 30,000 tapes.
Holy moly! That's a lot of swapping.
Yeah. If you think about it, the only reason it was on 30,000 is because it wouldn't all fit on one, right? Which means this was a one piece of data that had been broken into 30,000 pieces just so that they could get it off the boat and send it back to shore. So in Spectrum Data, when we were receiving these, the projects would often take months to perform just to get the data off and put it all back together into one logical chunk of data from 30,000 individual chunks. They all had to be in the right spot in the right order, fused together in the right positions. Otherwise, the data was a bit nonsensical. So often what would happen is we would receive those tapes, we'd read them all in, and then we would have to store those tapes for a period of time somewhere while we were doing the work, just in case we needed to go back to read another tape.
Okay.
And I started to use a third-party offsite storage provider to store those tapes for me when we were carrying out the project work.
Yeah.
And I got really, really frustrated with how those people treated tapes and the customer. It was kind of like they held you to ransom. If you sent them the tapes, they'd go, okay, well, we'll put them in our vault, but if you want them back, there's a penalty if you're going to take them out permanently.
Interesting.
So I got quite annoyed, and so annoyed, in fact, that I started my own tape storage company and kind of changed the rules on how we would store customers' data. And firstly, we would never have penalties. Was
that in addition to Spectrum Data?
Yeah, it was another company which I also created at the same time as I had Spectrum Data, and that company was called Access Information Management, and we grew that over about a 5-year period, and then we sold that to a publicly listed company.
Cool.
And at the time of sale, we had, I think, around 400,000 tapes in storage.
Wow. Okay.
So some of the problems with tapes are, firstly, that for me, they tend to be a means to an end. They're not suitable for long-term archiving. They've always been a transport mechanism in the resource sector more than anything else.
Yep.
So I need to get a piece of data from a ship to my head office. And if I did it on hard disks, it would be horrifyingly expensive. Whereas with tapes, they're a little bit more transportable and so forth. So, but what that leads to, is the fact that they are and can be delicate, but also they have a two-sided relationship. And one side is that if you want to read a tape, you need a tape drive. And you can't just use any tape drive. You have to use the type of tape drive that wrote the tape in the first place. Yeah. So what you can end up with is orphan data, where you have the data on a tape, but you no longer have the equipment to read it. And it's so tantalizingly close. You can hold it in your hand, but you can't actually do anything with it.
Yeah, okay.
I found that to be quite frustrating. I thought, who the hell does that? So that's another issue, is that it's on two cycles. The first cycle is the media itself will have some life cycle issues, but also the tape drives themselves are no longer manufactured, or they're superseded with a new version. So
you know what? Just on that, I've got an analogy which I know is different but the same. So I remember it was the 1996 World Championship of Basketball. And I loved basketball back in the 90s. I still love basketball today, but I was taping all the Team USA games, the Dream Team games. I was taping on the tape. And I've still got those tapes actually in the cupboard, right, sitting over there. But, up to this day, I haven't really done the conversion process. But for me to be able to go and access this great game, which I can't actually find on the internet as well in its entirety, it's like a really good piece of history. I can't access it because I don't have a tape VCR anymore, right? So I get that from that kind of analogy. So it's a really true problem, right? However, all these companies, like for me as an IT guy, I think maybe less and less now, but anyone who has been in IT, say, in the 2000s and previously, has dealt with tapes and the problems with tapes, right? Because up to that point, that was really the only way to store data in this way, off-site securely, and in great numbers. So this is a very real problem, but I'll let you continue and talk about how you got to TapeArk.
Yeah, well, so because of this two-stranded problem, firstly, the media itself has issues. Secondly, you need the equipment. What I started to map out was that I noticed that on the tape drive front, in the 1960s, if you bought a tape drive, you would normally keep that for 15 years before you replaced it.
Okay.
And then the next iteration of tape drive came out, and that one lasted about 9 or 10 years, and then you'd replace it. Now, the way that LTO tapes are coming out, it's now up to LTO 9 or 10. They're coming out at 18 months to 2 years apart. And they're also becoming less backwards compatible. They used to always be able to go back 2 revisions and still read the tapes that you created 2 revisions ago on the new tape drive. They're now down to 1 revision.
Right.
They're making it harder for you to get to your old stuff, and they're releasing them faster and faster, and people are creating more and more data.
Yeah. Why is that? Why have they made it harder to? Is it just them trying to sort of double dip on the new technology, on the new hardware, on the cycle? Is that why they're doing that? It seems crazy to me.
I don't think so. I think I love to be cynical about tape, but I won't be on this occasion. I think it's a technological problem with just the sheer density that these tape drives have to read at, and being able to go backwards to different aerial. I shouldn't call it aerial density, but different densities is probably getting increasingly challenging for them to make them backward compatible. So I think there's a technical reason for it.
Yeah.
So what we call the tape drive life cycle is shortening, and that's causing people to upgrade their tape drives faster and faster because they need the capacity and they need the speed because they're generating more and more data. So they can't just stick with an LTO5 for 10 years, even though the drive would probably continue to work. They simply can't back up enough data, so they have to keep moving. what that's doing is that's creating more and more orphans faster and faster. So the cycle's getting shorter, the number of orphans is increasing. And each orphan in its own right is holding more and more content per tape. So you could look at it and go, oh, well, I've got a lot less tapes because they hold a lot more data. But the inverse of that is each tape holds a lot more data. And if you lose one tape, you lose a lot more information. So, that's one of the other challenges. On the media tape side, firstly, the thing that I noticed over the years, and we spent a fair bit of time doing research on, was that the condition of your media was highly linked to the brand of media that you purchased. It was less about how it was stored and more about what brand you bought.
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Good quality brands had special formulations in them to prevent certain things from happening to them. Cheaper quality brands didn't have those, and they deteriorated faster in normal environmental conditions. So we started then in projects when a customer would say, hey, I've got 4,000 tapes I need read. Can you give us a price? I would say, tell me what the brand is, because that actually was the thing that would determine how much work we'd have to put into doing a good job.
Yeah.
So brand became a big thing. And then the environmental storage and the handling of it is probably a distant third. I think storage companies like to promote that it's the only way to protect your tapes, but I think there's a bit of fallacy in that. The tapes are now quite capable of surviving in kind of tough terrain.
Because there's a market for this, right? Like obviously we hear about Iron Mountain and these sorts of guys are ones that people would be very familiar with. But I remember I haven't worked in the city since for about 4 or 5 years now, but I remember I was working in Perth and William Street. And I would say this is the same for any capital city around the world where there's businesses with on-site data centers or on-site equipment. You just saw these vans drive up and, pull boxes and boxes of tapes and basically transport them, right? It's some sort of like undercurrent sort of, dodgy sort of thing going on, right? But I noticed this from my window. I would see, because I was across from a data center. So I would see the same tape company come. It might have been you, actually. Who knows? It might have been back in Perth, right? It might have been the company that you created. But I noticed that, and that must happen on an immense scale around the world in terms of the total number of tapes.
Yes, totally. There's billions of tapes out in the market that have been written to and are sitting in storage vaults around the world that contain not just the World Cup of basketball, but the potential cure for cancer or what have you. I mean, all of that data is out there. So we'll get to I want to dive into a story around space and NASA. I'll tease that towards the end of the episode. I think that's a really cool thing that you guys have done there. But so you've got spectrum data. You've seen the problems with tape. You're trying to sort of solve them. You're building a business where you're seeing a way to ingest the data. You're charging, or you've realized there's a way to charge based on the type of tape it is. So this is becoming like a snowball type of effect in terms of the company. So how did you actually, where did TapeArk come from in terms of spectrum data? So I sold spectrum data to a US multinational, and I spent some time working for that company after it was sold as part of the handover process. And I was asked about 2 years into that engagement to attend an innovation session with their team to talk about some new innovations that maybe we could come up with for their business. I did some deep diving into tape, cloud, a range of other storage mediums, and kind of came to the conclusion that we needed to do something differently, and tape wasn't really the answer. And I guess just before that discussion, and the real foundation for where TapeArk came from was actually an email that I got from Amazon. It was actually a bit of junk mail, or an almost advertisement. And in that junk mail, I read something about the cost of something called Glacier Deep Archive, which is their low cost storage platform. Mm-hmm. And I immediately drew on a pad of paper on my desk when I read that email. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. Some quick math, and I plotted a graph, and I realized that at the cost of deep glacier storage, which they charge on a per gigabyte basis,
Yeah.
a vast majority of the world's collections of tapes would be cheaper if they were stored in the cloud than they would be if they were just left in Tape Vault.
Okay.
And of course, the upside to having them in the cloud is that they're accessible. You no longer need the hardware. You can use machine learning to start to power through your data sets and look for new trends and create new knowledge. Yeah. So it was that email that I got from Amazon that really triggered my thinking. And the next morning I woke up and I called my CTO and said, we're getting into getting data into the cloud. That's going to be our focus. And it took me 2 years to kind of finalize the concept and create the company, but that's where TapeArk really came from.
So basically you guys have you've been developing this in the way to ingest and the way to manipulate the tapes as they come and transfer the data. And then you've had this aha moment, from that email. It's crazy how things happen, but I think, history turns on a knife point sometimes, and sometimes it's an email. And you did the calculations, you saw it was great. Did you have the technology at the time to, number one, ingest it so that the ingesting is kind of like taking a tape, putting it through some sort of system, doing some sort of transformation of the data, and then putting it somewhere else? Were you were doing that to start with at Spectrum, or had that not really been the case until you thought about this idea in Glacier?
We'd been reading tapes and we'd been doing some format conversion. The target was never the cloud. And the difference between the cloud and, say, a local hard disk is the connectivity that you have to it. So if I gave you a petabyte of disk at your house and said, copy that to the cloud from your home using an NBN connection, it would take you quite some time to get it up there. So the challenges of bandwidth were there, but we could also see that was starting to lift. So we could see a number of different technologies all heading in the same direction at the right time. And to me, the concept of ridding the world of legacy tape and liberating that content started to become feasible.
Right.
So,
because you guys have got you guys have got, like, on the website, you've got the concept of data-driven mavericks, which I thought was quite interesting, and I'll put the link to the show notes on the letter that's actually penned openly to people. But did you just want to quickly go over that, because I think it's quite fascinating and really talks to what Tape Ark is all about?
Well, our fundamental purpose at Tape Ark was to liberate the largest collections of data on the planet, with the expectation that data could then be used in other projects, so that we could use the history of the world to solve future issues. All predictive analytics require historical context to be able to make their predictions. And prior to about 8 years ago, the world's collection of data was on tape. I mean, it wasn't in the cloud. There was no cloud. Every major corporate in the world and every SME in the world that had a collection of data they needed to store wrote it to tape. So it's only been about 8 years since the world's had the potential to store its collection in an addressable format. Prior to that, it was always going to be on tape. And so our mission is to liberate those collections, whether they be medical studies or research or space science or whatever.
So this is a true story about data that was sitting somewhere gathering dust, liberating it, but also, from my point of view and how I speak sometimes, is activating the data, right, and making it work for the greater good. Because for so long, data archive, it's just been an insurance policy, right, to sort of say, we're going to take this data, we're going to save it somewhere, store it forever. If we need it, maybe we'll go get it. But what this is doing, like you're saying, the liberation leads to activation, which leads to, making this data useful for us. The data drives the world. There was a quote about oil I saw on the website, which people use today quite liberally, in terms of data being oil. You can refine it, you can do that sort of stuff. I also talk about data by way of, like, uranium. I think, data can be dangerous as well in the right or wrong hands, but so powerful at the same time when you think about it. So I like to talk about it from the point of view of uranium, because I think that's a lot cooler, right, in terms of what you can do. And from that liberation point of view, I think this is such a powerful story.
Yeah. I mean, it gets me out of bed in the morning. Some of the projects we've done, we just finished 13 million movies for broadcast studio, and you would know these movies. It's not a Bollywood studio where you may not be familiar with the content. These are major motion pictures that are now in the cloud,
digitized,
heading
like safe
services.
Yeah,
you can monetize them. You can replicate them so that you've got disaster recovery copies. You can use machine learning to go through and find all the actors' faces and where they said certain words and where they were paired with another actor. So there's a tremendous amount of stuff you can do by powering that stuff.
Crazy.
But the hard part is that this customer had 15 or 16 petabytes and it was on tape, and there's no easy way to get that into the cloud, which is really what we invented.
Great segue. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about, as much as you can, because obviously there's a lot of IP here, but let's talk about the ingestion, and then, how you guys do well, to a certain extent, how you do the transformation and then the storage. And then I'm actually interested in the way that you then pull the data and make it useful, because from everything that we get told about Glacier is that, and, the deep archive and the deep freeze and all that sorts of real long-term storage solutions in the cloud is that, you can get them in there, but then to get them out, there's like time to first byte issues, there's cost involved. So I'm interested in that as well. So maybe start with the actual ingestion tech and in a roundabout way, how you guys do that. And then we'll finish up on, how you actually use the data when it's there.
Sure. Yeah. We'll go back to your example of your World Cup of basketball or World Championships or whatever it was you recorded with the Dream Team. If you got pushed, you could probably go find some cables in an old VCR and figure out how to digitize that, and get that 500 meg or whatever it is off of the media and use the video. If you had 13 million of those and you wanted to do it in a hurry, that's where you run into the issues that people have. So could anybody do one or two tapes? Yes. To do them en masse, which is what we're talking about, where you're doing 13, 15, 20, 100 petabytes of content, is a completely different challenge. And so we built a system called Ark Bridge, which is effectively a way for us to globally manage clusters of tape drives around the world. So I can log in from my Perth headquarters, and I can see every tape drive running in every office around the world, and I can control them all from that one portal. I can rewind them, eject them, load them, kick them off to read. And what we did was, I wanted the system to be so simple that largely anyone could walk in and use the ingest platform, because we wanted to remove the complexities of reading tapes from operators' hands and put it into the tech. So we built a fairly novel but simplified, effectively barcoding system where the operator really only has to scan barcodes to be able to initiate a read. That's it. They don't need to know whose tape the tape belongs to, which customer belongs to. So we were doing a job for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame I guess it was about a year ago, and we got to the final tape of that project, and the cleaner was in the data center emptying the bins, and I invited him over and said, "Hey, why don't you come read the last tape for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?" And he was able to do that with no instruction other than to tell him the three things he needed to do, and he was able to go off and ingest that tape into the cloud. So we built a really simplified way to do that. That's highly scalable, and we can remotely control it from anywhere in the world. As soon as I plug in a tape drive in any office, it automatically appears on our grid, and we can then use it for ingest.
So maybe explain that, because so effectively your software can plug into a tape drive in any office. And we're not talking, because I know you guys have your own facilities that you have run, and I think the reason why you're in Dallas is you're kind of setting up a new one there. But just explain that, because I've maybe lost a train of thought. So your software plugs in at an on-premises location with a tape drive. It can then effectively control that tape drive, and do the read back through to your ingestion engine?
Well, the ingestion engine, the hardest part of ingest is reading the tape. That's the hardest part. That's the hardest part for you. You won't have any trouble watching your video or editing your video. You'll have trouble reading your video. So our ingest engine is our mass tape ingest platform. That is the ingest engine. If you pair the scalability of taking 1,000 tape drives with a very large outbound internet connection, then you can push lots of data through that connection.
Okay, yeah.
So our scalability comes in the form of what I call horizontal scalability, where we can have many drives running horizontally as opposed to the way that it's conventionally done, where you may have a tape robot with 6 tape drives in it and 100 tape slots. You fill it up with tapes and the robot changes the tapes automatically for you. That's great and it's automated, but you can never read more than 6 tapes at a time because that's the number of tape drives you have. What I did was I flipped that on its head, and instead of having 6 tape drives and 300 slots, I have 300 tape drives and 6 people.
Right.
And so we horizontally scale it. Then we add the high bandwidth connectivity to it, and we're able to push large volumes of content through that pipe directly from the tape into the cloud account.
And that's where you got your facilities, right? Because this can only, the way you're describing it, it needs to be a specialized way to get it done, so you can actually horizontally get the data, in parallel, so to speak, and then effectively pump it up in a quick way as well. So that's the scale that you guys are working with.
Yeah, and we also wanted to eliminate the need for any local large-scale disk cache to store it temporarily while we were waiting to push it into the cloud.
Okay.
So our Dallas facility, which is where I am now, it has been set up specifically in Dallas because all of the interconnects across the United States go into the data center that we're in. So we're actually we're in the same data center as all of the major telecommunications companies' bandwidth is. So we have virtually unlimited, but we have multiple 100 gigabyte connections.
Yeah, and just talk about, so once the data goes in from a customer, like say for example the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? So the data goes in there, and then it's sitting there in Glacier. It's in the platform. You guys have a console that basically then allows customers to do stuff with that data once it's in there. Just explain that a little bit.
Okay. Well, we have two primary types of customer. One of the types of customer is a customer who has an immediate need for their content, and they're restoring it for a purpose. So a broadcaster, like the one I mentioned earlier, who wants to put it into a streaming service, say, they don't really want my portal in the way of them offering up you a copy of The Matrix or whatever it is you want to watch on Tuesday night. So that data is liberated into a platform that they've already created, ready to manage their content. So that's the one type of customer. The other type of customer is, I've got 30 years of tape. I may need to restore something from that at some point. I don't want to maintain all my legacy tape drives and software. I want to get the tapes out of storage, get them into the cloud, and then if I need a restore, I want to be able to go to a portal and get that done. So that's our other type of customer.
Okay.
That portal is simply go in, put in a request for the data that you want, and then we manage the restore in the background for them, so they can get rid of their legacy hardware, legacy software licenses, and their storage bill and everything.
So just on that, so obviously, because my space is in backup and whatnot at the moment, but and I've obviously dealt with backup all my career, given where I've worked.
Yeah.
If we get a piece of data, say if the tapes that I was doing back in 2002 when I started working, and we would pump it in, it was on a particular vendor's software and it had a particular tape drive. Once it goes into your system, you're kind of logging that data as such in a way that, even though it was backed up in a certain way on a particular Windows VM in 2002, you can still access that data in some way through your own proprietary portal.
Yes. So the first thing that we do is we virtualize the tapes. So we effectively create a digital twin of the tape, and we have a virtual tape drive. so that we can load that virtual tape into the virtual tape drive, and then we can effectively address it like it was a tape that was still in physical existence.
Yeah.
And to support that, we photograph every tape, we preserve all the label contents, we read the chips on the tapes to get all the details from the RFID chip that's stored in the tape. So we would be able to create an exact replica of a tape that you had, including the label and the case and anything you wrapped around it. We would have all that preserved.
Yeah.
Then there are hundreds of tape backup formats in terms of software formats like,
yes.
Exec or Net Backup or TSM or Veeam or what have you. We're able to read a good chunk of those with our own proprietary technology.
Okay, yeah.
So the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was Tivoli Storage Manager, and we were able to restore that for them directly back to files, and they could ingest that into another media platform.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So you guys are doing an intermediary read of the data, doing a transformation of that. You're writing plugs into different formats, different software versions, and then you're transforming it into something that you guys can then, store in your own way. I get it. Cool. So there's no need to sort of keep an old legacy backup vendors tech on hand, because effectively you've redone the hard yards to basically convert it into your format, make it accessible from your portal.
Correct. Yeah. And the first challenge, as you've still got with your basketball film, is getting the data off correctly from the tape before you can make use of it. So our number one priority is to liberate the content and protect it, followed by now how do you monetize that, or how do you use that content? And that tends to be the second phase.
Awesome, good stuff. All right, let's finish off now talking about a use case, and I think it's pretty cool. I think it wraps up everything that we've talked about. So this space, this NASA engagement that I've read about, I thought it was a really fascinating example of the power of what you're providing, right? So in 2 or 3 minutes, let's try and go through that. And I know we could probably talk about that alone for half an hour, but just give an idea of what that is, how you did it, and how it came about. And I think it shows the power of getting data, doing something with the data, activating it, and then creating some good out of that as well.
Yeah. Well, I'll try and do it in 2 to 3 minutes. So I heard on the radio years ago about some tapes that had been found underneath the Curtin University physics lab, and that a professor had built a machine that had created this data that had been put on the moon, and that the data had come back to Earth and been recorded to these tapes, and then those tapes were put underneath the physics lab. And I contacted that professor when I heard that they were lost, and we were able to, I went down under the physics lab, and they were literally laying there in dirt. We brought them back to our office and cleaned them up. These were obviously late 1960s tapes.
It's crazy.
So what they contained was the scientist Brian O'Brien had created what he called a dust detector experiment. And they were concerned that when the spacecraft landed on the moon, they didn't know what the surface was going to be like. And they were literally concerned that the spacecraft may just sink in and disappear.
Yeah, I get it.
They didn't know whether it was an inch deep or 6 feet deep or, what have you. So he built this dust detector experiment to place on the surface of the moon so that they could detect when the jets fired up for liftoff or what have you, sort of what happened to the dust. And given that there's no atmosphere, all of the experiments that were put on those Apollo missions were put up there, and they were all told to have dust covers on them. And then once the aircraft took off, the dust covers had to automatically remove themselves somehow on the moon so that they could start doing their experiments.
Yeah.
So this was recording effectively the measurements and the movements of dust on the lunar surface over long periods of time, months or even years. So that equipment is obviously still up on the moon. They never brought it back. And that data was sent back to Earth across multiple receiving stations around the globe, similar to the way the footage of them landing on the moon was broadcast via the dish in New South Wales, and then it went to Peru.
Great story.
And that's the data was sent back in the same fashion. So whatever receiving station was able to see the telemetry would pick it up and record it to a tape. And all of those tapes would get sent back to this professor who was Australian. And then he was in Sydney, and he brought all those tapes to Perth with him when he moved here, and was a lecturer in physics, and put them under the lab and forgot about them. So we went and got those tapes, and I worked with Brian to recover them. We then had to hand decode them to work out how the data was recorded to the tape, because it wasn't in a particular backup format.
Yep.
And it was also a mixture of data types, including engineering data from the spacecraft, as well as his measurements and other measurements from other experiments. And we pulled out his stream of content and then remodeled his content. And I think since we did that work, he made 3 or 4 additional discoveries, and he's published 8 additional papers related to lunar research based on the content that was recorded originally back in the 60s.
That is such a great example of the fact that there's so much potential for good in the data that's sitting around the world that's people would have forgotten about and seriously cannot access as well. That's tremendous in terms of just the story about activation and I guess why the company exists, right? It's you're kind of making the world a better place, by doing this sort of stuff, right? I mean, not too many people that I know love tapes. So on one hand, you're helping that side of things. There's a few people that love tapes, and I know a couple of them. I work with a few. But that said, you're leveraging modern technology to unlock old stuff effectively, and I love that. It's a brilliant story. I just might finish off with a couple of questions, and then we'll wrap up. But and I think you've kind of answered this, but in your take, how did TapeArk disrupt the market that exists? I mean, I think it's self-explanatory, but in a couple of words, how has TapeArk done that initial disruption?
The principal one was that everybody said that it wasn't possible to move these collections to the cloud. And when we saw that the pricing had changed to the point where the particular tape that you have, if you stored that in Iron Mountain, you would pay somewhere around $1 per tape per month. And the cloud storage equivalent of that tape would be 0.0001 of a cent per month.
Fractions, yeah.
The economics made complete sense. And I think I saw several things line up: price, connectivity, and AI and ML, and the use of that content to actually learn new things, and there's a business that intersects these 3. And so I think we're disrupting the physical tape storage business, as well as opening up new content for people to process using ML.
Awesome. And what about future innovation? How are you going to, I know that you guys are doing something around paper recognition with videos and archive boxing, but, maybe quickly mention that. But then in terms of the future, how do you continually disrupt your own selves and continue to innovate?
Well, it is one of our core philosophies, is to always try and find a better and faster and cheaper way to do what it is we're delivering for the customer. So innovation really is at the core of what we do. There's nobody in the world that's done what we've chosen to do in the way that we've chosen to do it. That's for sure. It's very, very unique. And, if we boiled and distilled down our core kind of reason for being, it doesn't have to be tape. We were really interested in liberating legacy content. Anything that could be paper, it could be tape, it could be old recording medias, floppy disks, whatever. So one of the innovations we came up with was the ability to use video to look inside of a paper archive box and automatically analyze what's inside of it.
Like inside, without opening it, or just like, how do you?
No, you open it and you show the contents to the camera, and it tells you 6 folders. These are the titles. It sees all the text. It can tell you the color of
okay.
Text. There's a wrench in there. We'll say there's a wrench. If there's a picture of a dog, it'll tell you it's a Dalmatian.
Okay.
It's like 2 years old. So we use AI and different models to look at the content and turn it into something meaningful.
Because if not on tape, where is the bulk of the rest of the data in the world stored? In archive boxes on paper.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah.
We should talk. I want to definitely follow up with that and see how you guys are going with that over the next sort of 18, 24 months. I think that's even incredible in itself, right? But yeah, we'll wrap up this episode. It was actually, fascinating to talk about your background, where you came from, how the company started, and what you guys are doing. It's a great space. And who would have thought we could talk for 40 plus minutes on tape? It's crazy, but I appreciate you coming on. So what I'll do is I'll wrap up, and just to make sure that if you would like to be on Great Things with Great Tech, please go to gtwgt.com or email myself at info@gtwgt.com. I'll put the show notes down, some interesting links to the TapeArk site, stuff that we've talked about today specifically. They can be found on the show notes. If you aren't subscribed and you're new to the show, please go to the YouTube channel and click on subscribe, or get us on your favorite podcast platform. And with that, thank you, Guy. Thank you, TapeArk. And we will see you next time on Great Things with Great Tech.
Appreciate it, Anthony.